Welcome to the Coach Doctor podcast, a podcast where we discuss aspects of sports coaching from grassroots to grandstands. I'm your host, James Barkell, and on this podcast, we hear from academics who research coaching. We talk to coaches on the front line from development levels through to professional coaches, and we discuss other elements of successful sporting programs with experts and practitioners from a range of sports science fields, motivational psychology, strength and conditioning, and many other elements required for successful performance. If you'd like to know more about what we do at the Coach Doctor, you can visit our website, thecoachdoctor.com.au, and learn more about our services, or follow me on Instagram at thecoachdr or Twitter at James_Barkell for more regular information. In this episode of the Coach Doctor podcast, I am talking with Dr Andrew Higham. Andrew has recently been appointed as an assistant professor at Heriot Watt University in Scotland, working in the areas of psychology and sports psychology. At the time of recording, he was a lecturer in sports psychology at Shefield Hallam University in England. He has published work in multiple academic journals, including Qualitative Research in Sport, Exercise and Health, Psychology of Sport and Exercise, and the International Sports Coaching Journal. He has also presented internationally at the International Council for Coaching Excellence Global Coach Conference, where I was fortunate to listen to Andrew speak. I was completely blown away, not just by the originality of his research, but also by his passion and devotion to his subject matter. In today's conversation, I wanted to discuss Andrew's research around coach wellbeing and unpack some of the challenges that coaches face, both in the spotlight and behind the scenes, in what can be a very fickle and pressure-filled world. Andrew, it's nice to chat again, and welcome on the podcast.
No, thank you ever so much for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to talking all things coach wellbeing, really.
Cool. Andrew, do you want to start by giving us a brief background into who you are and what led you down your research path?
Yeah, definitely. So my background has predominantly been in sport and exercise psychology for maybe the past 8 years or so. So my traditional background is more so in academia, so teaching. So over 8 years of higher education teaching experience. And whilst I was working, the opportunity arose to kind of enroll and apply for a PhD scholarship. And that's what kind of took me down this specific route of some of the things that we'll be talking about shortly. But I guess what kind of before that, what was kind of prior that led me into this topic here, area, is I studied a master's at Shefield Hallam University in the UK, in England. And for my master's, my research was all around morality. So what is deemed right or wrong, along the lines of kind of pro-social, antisocial behaviours, what is maybe morally right or wrong. It could be gamesmanship, sportsmanship, things like that within a football domain. And I was interviewing professional coaches in academy settings and in first team football settings. And I remember when I was talking to one of the coaches, and a quote really resonated with me and stayed with me, where one of the coaches said something along the lines of, football is everything I detest in life. The bitching, the backstabbing, all the things for self-preservation. And it was during that interview where I was starting to think that's quite a pertinent thing to say. And then, you go through the analysis process, and I kind of wrote up and was able to go on and publish that master's work. And then kind of from that, it just really resonated with me, where that to me sounds like there's something not quite right. And it sounds like probably their well-being is maybe being challenged in that space. And that's what led me to put together this research idea or area for the scholarship and pitching that to Shefield Hallam University, where I was fortunate enough to be successful. And then for the past 3.5 years, been working on that area for that period, which has been exciting, quite fun, nice to get immersed into research on a full-time basis, rather than maybe balancing it with a job, let's say. And that kind of took me down this route of this research, and I submitted my thesis in August this year. Went through the Viva process in October, was successful, which was great. So now I can officially say I'm Dr Andrew Higham. And from that point onwards, I've then just been associate lecturing in sports psychology at Shefield Hallam University, and also doing some associate lecturing work at my other institution that I previously worked at in Barnsley, where I'm based in South Yorkshire. So yeah, a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what I've been up to and where I'm at now.
Well, nice, mate, and congratulations on now becoming doctor. So it's a great achievement, and I remember the time when I went through that and finally achieved it. And it's a really big accomplishment. There's not a lot of people that do it, and there's a lot of people that do start and don't end up finishing as well. So congratulations, mate. It's very well done.
No, thank you for that. Yeah.
So before we unpack the research findings, can you give me a brief overview of what your research set out to understand, and what the heck is a photo elicitation approach?
No, yeah. So I'll start off with what it set out to begin with. So the kind of principal research aim was just to basically explore how coaches experience and make sense of well-being within football club context, specifically within the men's game. So I suppose just as a caveat, I'm based in the UK, in England, so this is all going to be resonating with English football. So that's where my research was predominantly set. I'll briefly outline the pyramid, where we've got like the Premier League, which is the top league in England. And then, for instance, we've got the Championship, League One, League Two, and it's like non-league football, semi-professional and amateur and grassroots. Typically, that's a quick overview, let's say. And yeah, my research was based within that kind of professional domain, so more so in the Premier League all the way through to League Two, so the four tiers of English football. And yeah, it was to basically explore how these coaches were experiencing, if at all, well-being, and how did they kind of make sense of it. So the research, or the general research around well-being, is quite conflated, if that's the right word. I can't get the words out, but in the sense of it's quite hard to define, hard to understand. A lot of different areas have operated in research silos, so it's quite hard to grasp what one area is saying compared to the other. So basically, I just wanted to go to these coaches and figure out what they viewed it as, and how maybe do they experience it, or how do they manage that. So that was the overall aim. And then I suppose under that, it was basically to uncover certain, let's say, social, contextual, some cultural influences when it comes to well-being. How, for instance, it might be a football organization or the culture of a club might shape their understanding and how they come to make sense and experience well-being. And then also to look at that temporality of well-being. And what I mean by that is that well-being is not necessarily a static state. It fluctuates over time. So it's going to interact with your environment. So the people who you interact with, the environment you interact with, and it's got a bit of a reciprocal relationship. So you can shape your environment, the environment can shape you, and it's the same when it comes to well-being. So that was mainly what my thesis endeavored to uncover. And then, yeah, you mentioned about the photo elicitation approach. So to kind of give it a bit of a brief overview, photo elicitation is a creative, qualitative research method, typically. It finds itself and it's related sometimes or compared against or even used synonymously with photo voice. There are slight differences between them, but nothing too pertinent. But photo elicitation, the clue is kind of in the name when it comes to eliciting information via the use of photos or images. So what I wanted to do within my thesis was, the first study, the first kind of chapter that I did was an interview to get a bit of a grounding, a starting point. And then I wanted to use other creative methods to maybe see if we can get coaches to express how they maybe view well-being in different ways. That might lead to richer interpretations, more richer interviews. It might kind of shift the power dynamics. So not as much as me as the research, but it puts the power onto them. So they bring their images, talk around it. So yeah, a photo elicitation approach, I essentially set the coaches, not a task, but I just said to them, look, could you bring a minimum of 2 images that best captures your well-being to our interview? A minimum of 2, but you can do as many as you wish. And I just want you to kind of source some images, whether you take them yourselves or get some copyright-free ones, just bring them to an interview and let's talk about it. And it was a nice kind of conduit to give them that power shift, to give them the power to come and bring, and they were the ones who could then direct that conversation. So I would literally just prompt and probe and be like, why did you bring this? How does it capture your well-being? So it's a nice approach, and it just allows for those more richer interpretations and allows those visuals cues that might lead to more enriching conversations and questions that you might not have asked in the first instance. So long story short, photo elicitation, you could basically say it's allowing your participants to bring some images to the interview and then to discuss those in a bit of an interview process, really.
Okay, great. And with those images, initially when you started speaking, I was thinking they're photos that they've taken in their at home or on holidays or whatever, but it's not necessarily their own photos. It could be any image off Google Images or from a magazine. It could be anything.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, so just to clarify that, so traditionally photo elicitation, the traditional approach is you as the researcher, you would bring images and you would put them in front and say, oh, what does this mean anything to you or not? And the reason why we adopted this different approach is because we wanted them to share their experiences. We wanted it to mean something to them. And as you've alluded to, what we did is there was quite a few reasons why we did this. One was to kind of work around their hectic, high workloads and their busy schedules, where I didn't want to say to them, look, you've got to go out and take pictures and add to their workloads. So I gave that flexible approach where you could use some copyright-free ones. But also we had to bear in mind confidentiality, anonymity. So for instance, if they wanted to be taking pictures, would their club allow them to? Being their organization, taking pictures, you got to think about the ethical considerations of having others in pictures. So that's why we kind of suggested to them, look, you need to be making sure you're getting consent or verbal consent if there's anybody else present in your photos, making them aware of what these images will be used for. But also, there was also that kind of research and academic justification where well-being itself is quite sometimes hard to articulate from an individual perspective. So why would we task them to take images that might not sufficiently capture their well-being at that point? So I'm more than happy to go into some examples further down the line, or if you've got any other questions, but it allowed them to bring images that they might not be able to capture themselves, but it captured their well-being more accurately than going with their smartphone or with a camera and so on. So what I mean by this, it allowed them to capture some literal images, so maybe taking it on their phone or with a camera, but also abstract. And those abstract ones could be copyright free, like you say, a Google image as such. And it just allowed these real differences in interpretations and what they might mean. So going from literal meanings to abstract meanings. And again, that enrichment of that conversation that we had.
Okay, yeah. I think as we go on, maybe you can sort of shed some light on some examples, but I'll go to the next question first. There tends to be a lot of research and a lot of information on promoting athlete well-being, but the same can't be said for coach well-being, in my opinion. Why is this something that has not really been addressed in much detail until recently?
Yeah, another good question. And I think from my perspective, and it does align with the research trends. So I would say that coach well-being and also like coach mental health and those kind of research domains are probably still within their infancy, but growing at quite an exponential rate, growing quite rapidly and getting the much needed attention that it deserves. But I also think it's because athletes are often the ones prioritized. And what I mean by that is when it comes to researchers, it tends to be looking at those performing, let's say on the pitch, in the swimming pool, on the court. The focus tends to be at those athletes. And then also putting on, let's say, my coaching hat and also my academic, so teacher or lecturing hat. Those roles are stereotypically considered a caring role. So we have to care for others. We've got a duty of care. You kind of take on that guardian role or mentor role. So typically, I think it's because naturally we gravitate towards those athletes because, as I've alluded to, they're the ones that are perceived to be the ones performing on those kind of, like I say, pitch, court, swimming pool. They're the ones that have got a lot of the attention on them. So I think naturally research gravitates towards that and wants to look at how their performance can be improved. So maybe more so paying attention to their well-being, more so to their mental health, let's say, and how we can help develop them so then they become more resilient, let's say, they can perform better. Whereas arguably the way in which I've tried to view it is that, well, coaches are performers in their own right. I think there was some foundational work a couple of years ago, say maybe 10 years ago. I think it might have been by Daniel Gould and colleagues, actually argued for the fact that coaches should be seen as performers in their own right. And I think it might be a throwaway comment, but I think sometimes coaches tend to be forgotten about because they are at the sideline and sometimes they are in the background. And as I've alluded to, them might not get as much media attention. Now, in England, when it comes to, let's say, professional football, you know, football is so well renowned in England and it's so globalized and televised. So those coaches tend to be in the kind of media and have that attention a lot more than maybe some other sports. But again, in general, the players are the ones who will get most of that attention. So I do think sometimes they probably are seen as more so on the sideline, which could be why it's not been as well received or as had much attention. But yeah, I think that could be the case. But there is a lot of growth, and I think that's only positive. I think since I started the PhD research, the amount of publications I'm seeing coming out now has grown greatly, and I think it's nice that we've started to see actually I think it was this year we've had two position statements come out around how we might support coaches and their well-being, their mental health, and I think that shows that this demand is there and that hopefully it starts to drip feed through to, let's say, organizations, governing bodies, and then hopefully we might to see some more kind of impactful research come off the back of that. I hope that makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and it really rings true because I guess when I started my coaching journey, I felt like it was so important to consider the players, and they were the ones on the park or on the field performing, and we had to make sure that their well-being was completely looked after. But from my own perspective, I never thought about myself, but I might be, being in a lot of positions, a volunteer coach, I was also working. So I had work stresses and work deadlines that I needed to meet. Then I wanted to do a good job in coaching. So I wanted to be prepared and organized and have all these other things done. Then, there was family life and all these other aspects that were outside of coaching. And sometimes I found it really, really stressful fitting everything in, but I wouldn't share that with anyone. I just sort of keep that to myself. It's like, this is my issue. I don't need to sort of burden anyone else with my issues. And I never really thought about it as being an important thing. But like you said, at different levels, at professional levels, when you're in the media spotlight, there could be a lot of stress put on coaches. And I think that might change as you go down from the really elite levels to those part-time volunteer coaches. But they all have different stresses, or they all have stresses that are appropriate to their level.
Yeah.
And I guess that sort of takes me to that next question. What are some of the other stresses that can affect coach well-being on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, well, you've just shared some of your own lived experience there, which actually resonates with some of the findings from the coaches that I spoke with. And I think one of the things, I know when you asked me at the start what brought me to this research, and it's something that I actually mentioned in conferences before, and it might have been the talk that you attended out in Singapore, where, who's looking after the person looking after everyone else? Because that tends to be the role of a coach. You're looking after everyone else, but tend to forget about yourself, or it might be decided to neglect yourself. So you alluded to there, it might be work-life stresses, it could be personal life stresses, the blend of the two. And you also said about the different levels, so the contextualization of things. And that's something that I've tried to argue within my work, and that trying to share in that research domain, that well-being should be explored from a contextualized lens. It depends on that person, so it's quite idiosyncratic, it's quite individualized, but it also is contextualized to their environment, their demands, their kind of life at the moment. So yeah, when it comes to some of those stresses, I'll not go too deep into the kind of research and philosophies and things that I've adopted, but one of the things that I did implement within my work to try and, let's say, categorize, or let's say explore different levels of potential stresses, demands, challenges, and where they could be coming from, is there's something called the process, person, context, time model. And the context aspect is really important because it draws upon the likes of Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems. Now, what that means is we have different levels of context, or different systems that we are involved in. We have something called the microsystem, which is what we have immediate contact with. So that would be work. It would be being at home. It would be friends, family, colleagues, those people we interact with on a regular basis. And then we've got different levels all the way to the outer kind of systems, which could be like the macro system, which is things like cultural norms, politics, all those kind of things that could shape and influence and cause stresses and challenges, and how we might come to view and navigate well-being. So starting in the kind of initial one you've alluded to there's the work stresses. So think about it. If you're a professional coach, even if you're a voluntary coach or a community coach, you're looking after athletes, depending on the age ranges you're working with, whether it's youth athletes or whether it's professional adults, they're going to come with their own stresses and challenges. But straight away, that's something that you are the kind of pivotal point of coaching them, educating them, helping them develop. So there's those challenges and stresses. Then, for instance, you might have organizational. So the next layer, it might be the kind of the club or the organization that you're at. What are their targets? What are their objectives? What do they want you to hit? What do they want you to achieve? Is it performance orientated? Is it development orientated? Is there a certain time scale that you need to meet something, so a deadline, and all those things that are then playing into it. Then there might be the kind of hidden, and I say hidden, but the more so not apparent, let's say, challenges and demands within those systems. So it could be, what is the culture like of that club or that organization? So what are the kind of social norms? What are the social hierarchies? Are you a new coach who's just come in, who's trying to become accepted? Or are you kind of well established and everyone's trying to appease you and conform to your way of thinking? And how do you navigate those, maybe let's say, power dynamics? So there's a lot of things there within that sporting context, and there's many, many others. We alluded to, or you may have mentioned earlier, around, let's say, the media and things like that. So, how you might be portrayed in the media if you do get media attention, or how do others view you, and kind of maybe, let's say, appeasing fans and all the other things that come with it. So that's a lot of stresses and challenges. But how I also view it is that, yes, we can put that coach at the middle of those systems and branch out, but they aren't just a coach, they are also a human being, a person. So then they're not just a coach. So it might be a husband, a father, it might be, a wife or a mother. So there's different identities there that are also at play. And you've got to think about, it might be those personal challenges or stresses. So it could be the case of what's going on in family life. Is there a long commute when it comes to, let's say, if you're traveling for games, and are you staying over in hotels, and there's that kind of absence and that stretch away from family? Is it the case of something as simple as your shower's got a leak or your car's broken down? Those are things that we might forget, but they're average day-to-day things that can cause those stresses that will ultimately inform how you go about your day-to-day kind of working and functioning. So this kind of model and this approach just tries to understand that, yes, there's the kind of demands and challenges and stresses within that coaching or, let's say, sporting domain, but let's think more holistically and wider. So it might be, there might be different kind of cultural norms or societal pressures that in Australia compared to what there is in England, and how that might then shape your, let's say, coaching philosophy or how you go about it and stuff like that. So I know that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but this is why I find it so fascinating, because there's so many intricacies. And that's why I think when it comes to someone's well-being, we've got to kind of understand that person. We've got to understand their context and their life world, and understand what's going on at that moment in time and what's coming up in the future, but also maybe a little bit about their biography. So how were they brought up? What were their coaching experiences like? And has that informed how they maybe then go on to cope and manage as such? So there's a lot of complexities there when it comes to, present kind of actions, looking ahead and looking at the past, and how that might shape how they could cope or even manage and appraise certain challenges and stresses.
Yeah, great. I've really enjoyed that answer. It was really interesting. Like I said, I think I was sort of thinking of those, really contextual things that have to do specifically with coaching, and those things. I guess you explained it. Those micro areas, like family life and work life, and all those things we come into contact with regularly. But the way you sort of explained it, and I guess those circles as they spread out to that more macro, those macro events, it's really interesting. Yeah, I really, really appreciate the way you explain that. In saying that, and I'm not sure if this came up in your research or came up in your findings, do you think that coaches are spending enough time working on their own well-being? I know I've never really looked at that myself,
Yeah. No, again, another fantastic question, and I think it's one that probably doesn't get asked enough. And what I mean by that is in a genuine sense. So I can't speak on behalf of every single coach in England and such, but the ones that I did speak with, I think the majority, if not every single one of them, said, I've never really openly spoke about my well-being, or nobody's genuinely asked how am I, or what is my well-being. And I've actually mentioned this a few times within the past month or so to other colleagues and peers. How often do we maybe bump into a friend or bump into a colleague and we say, oh, it might be, morning, James, how's things? Yeah, good. Yeah, how are you? Yeah, yeah. And then we crack on, and we kind of dismiss it. It's just, we do ask how each other, but are we genuinely asking, and do we spend time looking at how we are and stuff? And there's many different reasons as why people might not genuinely ask, and why people might not want or might not feel comfortable opening up. But I think, yeah, from my research and speaking to these coaches within the professional context of English football, the majority of them alluded to it was the first time they could openly and honestly and feel safe enough to actually voice their opinion around their well-being. They've never really had the opportunity to actually take a step back and think about, oh, actually, how am I, doing, like genuinely? And I think that speaks volumes of the coaching profession, which is, it's probably the same whether you're in Australia, you're in the United States of America, based in Asia. It's quite a demanding role. And, you can speak probably more accurately than me about that, with your background and coaching knowledge. But, it is quite a relentless profession at time. And it doesn't matter if you are an elite level coach, let's say professional coach, or even if you are a voluntary coach or community coach, because they all come with their own challenges and demands, but it is quite relentless, unsociable hours at times, whatever profession or whatever level you're at. So yeah, there's a lot of demands that come with that. And one of the things that actually come out from my research, and it was kind of going back to that photo elicitation approach. A coach came to one of my interviews. So for this study, it was a longitudinal study over 9 to 10 months, and there was 4 data collection time points. So we had a time point at the start of the season, 2 midpoints, and then close of season, representing a traditional English football calendar season. And during one of those time points, a coach brought an image, a stock image of a to-do list. So if you were to go on Google and type in to-do list, there's like a little notepad, some comments, and a pen and a tick box. And he brought that because what he was articulating is that he's like, I've got so much to do. My to-do list is so long. He kind of reeled off a load of things, saying that it's really challenging his well-being because he feels like he hasn't got time to box it all off, so on and so forth. And we kind of spoke about that. And then because he brought that image, it then allowed me just to ask this prompt, this one question, because I was like, okay, you've brought a to-do list and, prioritizing things. And I just said, okay, so you've got this to-do list or this priority list. Where are you on that list? Are you even on that list? And he kind of chuckled and then also gasped at the same time. I'm like, do you know what, Andy? I'm not. I'm not on that list. And I was like, how does that make you feel? Or what's your thoughts on that? And when he started to again, we got into a bit of a discussion and a conversation. And he came to the conclusion just through us having that conversation that maybe if he might have prioritized a little bit more time for himself, or maybe had himself higher up on that to-do list, priority list, a bit of self-care, that rest, that bit of respite might have then transferred into performance gains. So he might have been more efficient at doing the other things that he needed to tick off. And I know that sometimes can come from a privileged position and it's easier said than done. But he started to maybe actually acknowledge that, if I did pen in or kind of box off a little bit of self-care or designated a bit of time for me, my time, me time, then that might allow me to be more efficient and perform better at my job. So there's kind of performance gains to be had if someone's more, let's say, well rested, their well-being's more stable and not kind of being impeded. So yeah, it was quite an interesting discussion that led from that. And then something else is that I don't think when it comes to those kind of responsibilities, I know I alluded to it in the previous question you asked around the kind of coaching role is a caring profession, and it's just a bit like contradictory that they are always constantly caring for their athletes. They're always constantly caring about doing a good job. Because I don't think many coaches go into it because they don't care and they want to do a subpar job. They obviously really are passionate about what they do, and that came across with the coaches that I spoke with. But it's almost like they're putting their athletes at the top and everything else at the top, and they don't even make that list and just become neglected. So I think that's one of those things that really stood out to me, is that they're putting all these other responsibilities ahead of themselves when actually they're not even becoming a priority to themselves anymore. So I think that just shows the maybe culture that is within coaching, depending on what level you're at, that typically you're always putting others before yourself. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, or whether you've done that yourself. It'd be interesting to hear what you think.
Yeah, I think when you said that, when you mentioned the to-do list, I was thinking all the things that, coaches have to do. I didn't think for 1 minute that you'd be bringing up the fact that where are you on that list? And you're 100% correct. And I reckon most coaches would probably agree or feel like that's the case for them as well. So it's really, I think you've highlighted a really, really good point there. It made me also think about an example back in Australia in rugby league. We've got a new coach. It's, I think, for his first year coaching in the NRL here.
Okay.
And during the bye week, he took a holiday with his family to spend some more time, reconnect with his family. And, as we know, that coaching is such a busy, busy job. And the media scrutiny he got for that on the talk shows, in the newspapers, he's not committed to his job, and then they went back to other coaches who were very, very successful in their roles. And it was like, would Wayne Bennett be doing this? Would Wayne Bennett be taking a weekend off during the season? Or would Craig Bellamy, or, all these other, really well-established, high-profile coaches, he was being compared to them. And, at the time I felt that's really unfair. This is a new coach. Is a lot of stress. I think that the team he was coaching was coming towards the bottom of the ladder at the time. So, there was stress on him from that perspective as well. And then, wanting to spend a bit of time with his family and reconnect and, recharge the batteries, he's now being sort of scrutinized for that as well. It's sort of like you can't win, or you can't hide from the media. And when you do try to, like you said, him going away and spending some time with his family is potentially going to improve his coaching performance.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So yeah, I think you make a really good point there, and it'd be interesting to know, or how many coaches out there that might be listening to this podcast spend some time on themselves and include themselves on that to-do list.
Yeah, definitely. And you make a valid point there. It's something that I wanted to address as well. It's almost like it's celebrated or glorified that coaches have to be working 24/7, or you have to be shown to be doing that, to be committed or to be serious. Whereas you think about your athletes and your players. Well, rehabilitation, rest is a key part of performance. Why can't that be the case for a coach? So rest comes in different forms, and one of those is spending quality time, let's say, with family or going on holiday. And yeah, it's very frustrating what you just mentioned there, because some people have, let's say, not the best views on things, and especially the media. Don't get me started with the media.
Yeah. It's funny, again, just thinking on that. I spoke to a coach called Daryl Gibson, who's a rugby union coach, and he's coached, professionally, played for the All Blacks as well. And we talked a lot about going through a losing season. And that's probably one of the big stresses that came across to you as well. But one of the things he said, when you're losing, you tend to work even harder, and you're trying to come up with a solution, and you take even less time for yourself. And that's probably another factor that coaches have to deal with. They're trying to look for the answer, so they actually end up working harder and becoming more stressed. And he said, looking back at that wasn't the right thing to do. The right thing to do was to sort of step back, refocus, take a breath, because it's going to be better for you're like you said, like it's going to be better for his coaching performance down the track. So yeah, I think you've really hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, one of the potential explanations for that, and some of the research shows, is it could be down to passion. So for instance, coaches, as I've alluded to, are really passionate about, their craft and what they do. And like you just say, if you're on a losing streak, you want to get back to winning ways, you want to get back to performing and competing at the level that you believe you should be at. Sometimes it's like self-imposed, let's say, kind of um, self-imposed levels that you want to achieve. And there's certain things like obsessive passion. So what I mean by that is you become obsessed to the point where you, like I've said, you want to get back to winning ways. You need to get back to winning ways, and you'll endeavor to do anything, and you'll start working, like you've said, 10 times harder. And that passion that is really positive, that can be so motivating, then turns into something that could be quite detrimental. And I think, like you've just alluded to, you know, I completely agree, and I've given the advice that you said about, taking a step back, maybe resetting. But sometimes I don't even take on board that advice. Let's say if I'm kind of embedded in something and so highly immersed, everything becomes tunnel vision, and I just forget about everything else. And sometimes I think that's why, let's say, social support or having someone others who could maybe identify those signs, maybe to intersect or interject and just be like, look, let's start afresh, or let's take a day off, for example, just one day, just to reassess things. Because so easily we can throw ourselves straight back into it and become 110% into it, and then it just becomes a bit of a spiral, and nobody's really benefiting from that. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and then another thing that when I was reading your work, you talk a little bit about social or that isolation, and
Mhm.
we know that coaching, or we hear the term that coaching can be a really lonely job sometimes.
Yeah.
Why is it that coaches feel isolated? And I think I mentioned before, why is it that we feel like we have to just keep our issues to ourselves and we can't share it?
Yeah, again, another great question. And it's some, as you alluded to, some of my work touches upon these aspects and trying to unearth what could be potentially some of those reasons. And I think there's a multitude of reasons that come with that. Yeah, one of the coaches I actually spoke with and interviewed said that coaching and management is such a lonely profession, really isolating at times. And one of the reasons I think why that could be the case is because, and again, now I'm taking it from my research in, let's say, professional football organizations and clubs, is that it can be highly competitive. So, for instance, a lot of coaches speak around, wanting to compete, wanting to win, or a need to win kind of culture. So again, that club, that organization is imposing, look, you need to win. And I think, they probably don't want to open up and don't want to voice, let's say, how they're feeling, or don't maybe want to reach out to, let's say, anyone, because that might be seen as showing some vulnerability or showing some weakness that others might be able to expose and capitalize upon and get performance gains. So I think because coaching, especially within the domain of professional football, can be quite highly competitive, like it is with most other sports, sometimes it could be the case that it's quite isolating because they do just literally, batten the hatches and put up that wall and shut people out. And maybe they might have a close group of people around them, but sometimes it could be the case of that they literally don't want to be demonstrating that vulnerability, that weakness, or maybe allow the opposition to get a performance gain. So that could be one of the potential reasons. I also think it could come down to the culture. And again, I can only speak on behalf of the coaches that I spoke with, and 90% or 99% of those were men. And typically within the UK and England, and it might be similar within Australia, but there tends to be quite a lot of kind of masculinity and social norms around that, and what is perceived to be a man's man. And with football, and the research shows that again, it's kind of workshop like banter and masculinity, and you've got to show that toughness, and there's phrases that get thrown around like man up. So when it comes again back down to why it could be quite isolating and also quite a lonely profession, is because can a coach, or let's say a male coach, or even a woman coach operating in a masculine dominated sport, can they be their authentic self? And what I mean by that is, can they demonstrate how they are truly feeling? What emotions are they going through? What's their genuine opinions? If their well-being is struggling, can they voice that? Can they openly say, look, I need a bit of help here, I need a bit of support? Or so I think there's a lot of to be said around the kind of cultural side of things, not just in sport, but in, let's say, everyday life. So the culture that's kind of attributed to being, let's say, a man, and how you should act and behave. And probably, if coaches maybe don't communicate because they're trying to keep together how they're maybe truly feeling potentially. And then on that, I think there's so many, and I won't go on and on and on. I could go on for hours, but another one that springs to mind is job security. So again, when it comes to that kind of loneliness and isolation, again, it probably ties into the two other factors that I've just mentioned, but also the kind of job insecurity that comes with these high-profile positions or working within professional sport. So again, it might be a case of a coach maybe withdraws and is quite isolated because, again, it might be seen as something that could maybe, if they were to reach out to others or maybe not kind of, or let's say show their authentic self, then it might look unfavorably. People or hierarchy might question whether they are suitable for the role or whether they are, working efficiently in that role. Therefore, we're going to fire and hire someone else because there's a, kind of a hire culture that goes on within some sporting domains. So they're three that springs to mind, and it depends on the context of that coach. But for me, it's one of those where I wish that wasn't the case. I spoke double figures of coaches, and a lot of them did say it's very isolating, very lonely. But a few of them did say that they do reach out to other coaches, which I thought was a real benefit. And if there's any coaches listening, I would definitely encourage to create a bit of a community of practice or a bit of a coaching community, or reach out to those that you feel like you can trust, or share your opinion with, whether it's in your own club or whether it's external or even if it's just a friend. I think it's really important to share those shared experiences because a coach might be going through something very similar to yourself. And I actually look back through my thesis, prepping for our little podcast and our talk here around what were some of the coaches saying. And one coach said in particular that, coaches and managers, they'll gravitate to each other maybe after they've competed because they're the only people in that room or in that current context that understands what each of us going through. All the stresses, the challenges, the constant ruminations about what if this happens, what if that happens. They're the only people who really know what it's like to be in their shoes. So they do sometimes gravitate to each other, which I think is a real positive in the sense of sharing those kind of thoughts and feelings. But I don't think it happens as much as probably what it should do. So yeah, it's really interesting. And I think that, we talk about the news and the media and how that also can add to things and not in a positive light. Something that came to mind in the football world is Pep Linders, who was Jurgen Klopp's assistant manager or assistant coach while at Liverpool Football Club. He was recently appointed to, I think it was RB Salzburg, so Red Bull Salzburg Football Club. It was appointed in August time, and he's only recently just been sacked, so probably less than a 6-month period. And I think, again, when it comes to that isolation and feeling, that detachment, coaches just aren't given enough time to maybe build positive relationships where they feel comfortable to open up and actually be them true selves. So if you're a coach going into an organization or you start a new coaching role, it takes time to build relationship. It probably takes time for your kind of barriers to come down or for other people's barriers to come down to build those, to then allow you to maybe form more positive relationships and longer lasting relationships that then would probably mitigate those feelings of isolation. So there's so many intricacies going on there. And I think what I'd encourage is coaches to be more open, but also not just the coaches, I don't want to put the emphasis on them, but organizations maybe facilitating that openness. It could be the organizations or a club getting coaches together, sitting around a table, talking, being open and honest with each other. But it also is let's say you said Australian rugby, it could be, American baseball, basketball, any kind of, let's say, governing body. Why not create a bit of a platform or a forum for these coaches to actually network and get together and talk? I think that could be only beneficial. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but there's a lot that probably explains why potentially they are quite isolated at times.
Yeah, and look, a lot of those, especially at professional level, have sports psychologists or people who look at athlete wellbeing now on staff. It's almost like, why don't we just utilize book in an hour a week or whatever it might be for the coach as well. It makes me think of the Ted Lasso series. He was going through a lot. He moved countries. He was coaching a sport he never coached before. He was going through a marriage breakdown and missing time spending with his son. But then there are all these other factors involved at the club. But in that series, even Ted, who was such an advocate for athlete well-being,
Yeah.
was so hesitant to open up and talk with the psychologist in the series. That was sort of like an underlying theme in that series as well. That again made me sort of look back at my own well-being, my own performance, and think, hey, as coaches, we do have to sometimes find someone that we can talk to, and sometimes we can sort of unload some of our issues on as well. And I think that could be a great opportunity for clubs to do that and encourage the coaches to have some time to talk with the psychology staff.
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting because it's probably different in different countries and different sports. But within, let's say, the England kind of football setup, it's not compulsory to have a psychologist. It's not compulsory to have a physiotherapist, let's say, but it's almost deemed essential to have a physiotherapist. Because they want to do rehabilitation or physical rehabilitation, or support and stuff like that. But when it comes to, like you just said there, I think psychological support is so underrepresented and underappreciated, and sometimes is the first thing to be kind of let go or not even considered. So yeah, I would definitely encourage organizations, if they can afford to reach out and get some of that support, or at least signpost to where that support can be accessed. I think that's so important because I go back to that example of a player, let's say they've got an ACL injury. The first thing they're going to do is go and see the physio and go through physical rehabilitation. But let's say, for instance, an athlete is struggling with, let's say, anxiety or motivational issues. Half the time there isn't, or there might not be, a psychologist in place because the club's not appointed one, or someone that can seek support and help them, get back to, let's say, their perceived normal self. So yeah, you make a valid point there, and that's something that I think is so underutilized, and also unfortunately not really well appreciated within sporting context, is that access to psychological support.
So in your research, you've identified 5 experiential themes from coaches, and these were: I belong to the game, he belongs to the game, you need the right people around you, it's difficult to describe the manager without describing the person, and the last one, people are trying to stab you. Some of these are fairly self-explanatory, that being a head coach, you've always feel like there's someone behind you trying to take your job. But what about the others? Like, can we just go through and unpack like what I belong to the game or he belongs to the game means, and maybe if you can remember some of the images, I guess, that elicited these sorts of feelings.
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. So these kind of themes were taken from a study where I actually analysed some of the All or Nothing docuseries. So when it comes to Amazon Prime, it's kind of like a fly on the wall docu series or documentary style TV show where we can look at elite coaches. So for instance, this looked at Pep Guardiola, Mikel Arteta, Jose Mourinho, and also Diego Simeone. And there were some real key themes here that stood out, and these 5 were the most important ones that kind of came out of that data. But yeah, these also did resonate with, like you just mentioned there, some of the images that was applied in the photo elicitation stuff. So for instance, the I belong to the game, and this is all around kind of becoming consumed by the role. So what was apparent from some of these elite level coaches, and as we've alluded to, is that, and we've talked about, when you go into, let's say, that losing streak or something's not right, you kind of just become tunnel vision and you become so immersed in it and you just throw everything at it. And you kind of go above and beyond 100%. You put in more hours than normal. And this kind of resonates with some work that I read from a researcher called David Seaman, who looked at this kind of concept of immersion in place. So we can become overtly or too much immersed in our kind of, let's say, coaching role. And that can lead to something called a lived obliviousness. So what we mean by that is coaching becomes everything, and you kind of become oblivious to what's going on around you and how certain things you might be able to change or tweak could lead to better performance gains, or it might lead to better well-being or better your well-being being better managed, let's say. So yeah, this I belong to the game is that an individual can just throw themselves probably too much into that coaching role. Their identity becomes synonymous with being a coach. So they start to forget that they are a person first and foremost, and actually that coaching starts to kind of take over things to an extent. Again, because they're that highly immersed within that role. So yeah, some of the coaches that I actually interviewed as well, they spoke around being highly immersed in that role, how it can kind of take over their lives. There were examples of coaches would supply images. There were one coach in particular who, in the first time point, supplied, I think it was about 4 images, and every single image was of him coaching. So it was like either on the pitch, by the sidelines, these was his actual images with players and things like that. So it was all fully just I belong to the game, I'm investing in the game, that I want to be in the game and all this kind of stuff. And then as time went on throughout this research and kind of speaking to this coach and unearthing about, it's not just being a coach, it's about being, a good husband, a good father, spending time with family helps their well-being and all these kind of side of things. And what I started to notice throughout that photo elicitation study that was about 9, 10 months is that his images started to become a blend of a little bit of coaching, but more so family. So he'd send me pictures of him around the table having a meal with his family or going out, spending some time with his son, going to a football game. And you started to see more of a blend of work and home life. So we started to see a bit of behavior change occurring there, a bit more of a self-awareness that actually, spending time or doing other hobbies on the side or having a little bit of a self-care routine started to become more of his actual routine, coaching routine. So yeah, that kind of captures that I belong to the game. The second one around he belongs to the game, because this was kind of taken from those docuseries and video clips, this allowed for multiple perspectives. So within those docuseries, we actually got to have these elite level coaches, partners or wives, actually talk to the camera about how their partners act and behave. Also, sometimes the children would appear, whether they were really young children or maybe children who were adults, and we'll get their perspectives as well as friends and their perspectives. So a really good example of this one, this he belongs to the game just re-emphasizes that I belong to the game, but it's about how others can become impacted and how they perceive it. So for any of the coaches listening, it might be one of those where you might take a moment to reflect or maybe speak to your family or friends and partners and see how maybe those interactions occur. What do they notice about you and how do they probably perceive you as a coach? Are you fully immersed? Are you quite well balanced? Because an example of this one was taken by Diego Simeone, so the first team manager and coach of Atletico Madrid in La Liga, Spain. And in this docuseries, he had a short or a brief exchange with his daughter. And he says to the camera, it's my life. And what he meant by that is football coaching is my life. And his daughter corrected him. His daughter is 4 years old. And his daughter said, no, daddy, we are your life. Family is your life. And he kind of said, turned to the camera and kind of looked at it and said, do you know what? She's 4 years old, but she's actually right. And he started to become visibly upset and a tear came down his face because he was like, I've thrown myself that much into becoming one of the world's leading managers and coaches that I'm actually probably neglecting family to an extent. So it was about these perspectives of wives and children and friends and how they maybe perceived their partners or their coaches and how they kind of become fully immersed in that role. And another interesting one from that is that coaches, those specific coaches tended to confide more in their partners. So informal support. So they didn't tend to kind of confide in people at the club or the organization, or there wasn't anything reported around governing bodies as such. But what they would do is seek support from their partners. And I think that comes back down to that trusting relationship. So for instance, how long they've known each other for, that kind of unconditional love and support. So it's much easier for them to maybe confide in it. Again, an example from Diego was that he would sometimes get home from a match, like 1 a.m., 2 a.m. in the morning. He'd wake his wife up and they'd have a conversation about how things had gone. And she'd be there to support him at the early hours of the morning. Whereas if he didn't have that, what would he do? Is there a hotline he could ring, or would he just have his own thoughts? And, you could see how that might play out. The next one, when it comes to you need the right people around you, kind of insinuates about who you surround yourself with. So, for instance, a lot of coaches spoke around that social support, as I've alluded to. Some of it is informal, some of it might be other coaches in their organization. But yeah, the kind of standout finding from that one is that informal support was more so relied upon. So again, going back to the coaches that I've actually interviewed and we use photo elicitation with, a lot of them did actually start to talk around that they would probably seek support from friends, family members, as opposed to their organization because they don't feel like there's trust, they don't feel like there's security. They also alluded to a lack of education or knowledge around what support systems were in place, or if there are any support systems in place, they've not been made aware of them. So what are the organizations or the trade unions, what are they doing to help support those coaches? Maybe there needs to be more so kind of education or promotion of what maybe support services could be in place. And the next one was it's difficult to describe the manager without just describing the person. And that comes back to a couple of the conversations we've had already about, there is more to them than just being a coach. So it could be a husband, father, might be a wife or a mother. But what tied into this is, and it kind of stood out for me, is that identity plays a really important part when it comes to well-being. And again, it comes back down to that authentic and inauthentic self. So coaches they perceive their well-being to be flourishing or doing really well when their values and beliefs and their true identity could be shown in their organization. So if an organization, let's say, had a win at all cost mentality, or we need to win, it's all about performance. Whereas the coach, yeah, performance is important, but they want to work on development and long term. You can see there's a clash there in values and beliefs, and that then kind of pulled on their well-being. And to that point, they didn't feel like they could be their authentic self. So it was almost like there's research by a guy called Goffman who looks at dramaturgy. So it basically means acting. So sometimes coaches can be actors. Coaching sometimes can be considered acting because you need to be highly motivated. Sometimes you need to put on a performance. Whereas what he was insinuating is that maybe they're acting in the sense of maybe covering their authentic self and not being able to show their authentic self and just trying to conform to those club and norms that are out there. And then yeah, the last one, and it's not really a laughing matter, although the title does grasp your attention, is that people are trying to stab you. And it must be noted that all of these theme titles are actually quotes taken from coaches, apart from the "he belongs to the game" one, because Mikel Arteta came out and said that people are trying to stab you, and what he was alluding to is that the media can sometimes take something and spiral it out of control, or it might be opposition, it might be fans. They can say things and do things and can nowadays contact coaches on social media at any time of the day with no real repercussions. And it's the point where people are just constantly trying to either berate, argue, criticize, critique. Like I think you mentioned earlier, James, that sometimes you can't do wrong for right. Sometimes you just can't win. And there's always going to be someone who's got a contrasting opinion. But in today's modern society, where there's the media and social media, you can constantly be targeted. And that's one of the things that came out from this theme. And some of the coaches actually alluded to that, who I spoke with. Again, I'll give a quick example because I know I've kind of talked a lot in depth about these themes, but this coach said he had a colleague and he himself has experienced this, where he'll be out in the public, he'll be with family, he might be doing his general shop like a normal person, it might be in the supermarket, and all of a sudden someone will notice him and they'll start, giving him their opinion that 9 times out of 10 is a negative opinion. And there's been times where they've been berated in public, so people have been abusing them verbally, and they're with family, they're with children. And that kind of then becomes blurred lines of work and personal life, but it shouldn't happen in the first instance. It shouldn't even happen in the work domain. So you can see here where this theme tries to capture that sometimes there's always going to be people trying to stab you, and it's, well, what do we do about that and how do we try to overcome it? What do we need to kind of action here? So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but if you've got any particular questions on that, I'm more than happy to go over in a little bit more detail if you like.
No, I think you've done a really good job explaining all of those different themes. I was really interested to find out what "he belongs to the game" meant, and I think you've described that beautifully, especially using the example of one of the coach's daughters and that family sort of scenario, and the people trying to stab you. Again, initially I was thinking this is more focused on assistant coaches and people looking to try and take your job and, suggesting that they're on your team and suggesting that they're supporting you. But behind the scenes, often there might be scenarios where, if he goes, I'm going to go for his job sort of thing. So, there's sort of a bit of a conflict of interest sometimes with potential assistant coaches.
Yeah.
But yeah.
point. Yeah, sorry, I was just about to say you do make a valid point because from that docuseries paper that didn't come out, but actually the coaches I spoke to, that was something they alluded to. So football, especially in England, but I think in general the professional side of the game is quite rife for not only external conflict but internal. So again, like you've just alluded to, is maybe people navigating, trying to work up, sabotage. Come back to that quote that I mentioned from the master's work that I published around, the bitching, the backstabbing, the self-preservation. A lot of that does go on. So yeah,
Mm.
that does also resonate.
Yeah, I think the fact that you talked about the media's constantly trying to chop you down. Fans, if your team's not winning, they're trying to chop. They want your head, they want you sacked. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Um, One of your papers has in the title, "You wouldn't let your phone run out of battery," an interpretive phenomenological analysis of male professional football coaches' well-being. So it was a bit of a
Yeah.
mouthful. In this one, I'm assuming the phone is a metaphor for the coach. And what you're basically trying to say is, in life, we do, when we're out in public, we don't let our phone batteries run down. So why, as the coach, are you not taking yourself or your own well-being with that same respect, and you're letting yourself get run down? You're letting yourself, you're not looking after your mental health. I guess we've sort of discussed this quite a bit already, but I guess the moral of the story is: are the coaches letting their batteries run down completely from in your experiences?
Yeah, again, another great question. And I can't from the coaches that I've spoken with, I wouldn't say they've gone fully to 0%, but I think they're cutting it very fine, to that point where I'd be looking at my phone and panicking, thinking, oh, I need to charge this. And this the kind of metaphor here and the or analogy, whatever you want to call it, is trying to capture that where, you know, take his mobile phone, let's say that is the coach, and you see that 20% battery, you might be thinking it's in red, and you're like, oh, okay, I best charge that. How often do we do that for ourselves? And this kind of title actually resonated with some of the quotes that the coaches were speaking around, around energy, around battery levels. Jurgen Klopp actually came out when he left Liverpool talking about, his battery running low and energy levels running low. And I think actually an interesting way he pitched it was, I think he said that it was a kind of a fast sports car, but he's the only one who can see his fuel tank running low, and that's why you need to take a step back and recharge. Obviously, Jurgen was in a very privileged position, earning a lot of money, and he could do that. Whereas that's not probably the case for a lot of coaches out there. But yeah, it's kind of hitting home about how often do we as coaches or as even human beings actually pay close attention to our battery levels, and also do we know how we can actually charge those up? So yes, we try to sleep at times or get enough sleep, but what other things top up our, let's say, coach battery or our well-being battery? And could that be through personal hobbies? Is that through spending time with family? What is it that gives you energy that could maybe rejuvenate that? And also, can we become more aware of when that battery level is, getting close to 5%? Because yeah, that could lead to instances of, let's say, ill-being, and potential, let's say, burnout that could come from that.
Yeah, great. I'm just looking at the time. Have you got a couple more minutes to continue, or you've got to
Yeah.
rush off?
No, I'm all good.
Okay, perfect. I'll try and go through the last couple of questions a little bit quicker, but um, another one of your studies also looked at the experiences of female coaches. Traditionally, a male-dominated sport in football. What were some of the findings or implications, and did you find differences between the experiences of female coaches and male coaches?
Yeah, so this was actually quite an interesting research paper that recently published, and it was based. So throughout my PhD thesis, the longitudinal study over 9-10 months with the images that had 8 coaches, 7 of them were men, and one of them was a woman. And yeah, you make a valid point there with the similarities and differences, and there were some clear similarities, but there were also some stark differences. And 9 times out of 10, those stark differences occurred because of the sex of that individual, because they were purely a woman working within men's professional football club or an organization. So it wasn't a woman coach working, let's say, women's football. It was actually within that kind of men's professional game. So yeah, there were some real similarities when it came to, being really passionate, really immersed in the role. Their kind of identity was being a coach. One of the conversations I had with this woman coach was we joked about it, or she joked about it when she said, I'm never out of the tracksuit. People said, do you actually have any normal clothes? And that kind of reiterated her 24/7 working, which also resonates with a lot of the men coaches as well. So there's some real similarities. There were some stark differences. And I think a lot of it was around, again, just because she was a woman operating within that men's context, she would be exposed to, let's say, not great practices and also some of those stereotyping. So, for instance, she once turned up to a game and was ready to coach her team, and the opposition said, "Oh, are you the team's physio?" She's like, "No, I'm the coach." And again, it's that stereotype of a woman being in that coaching role. They straight away just associated with being a physiotherapist. So certain things like that. And one of the kind of things that came out of it was how she had to navigate this hegemonic masculinity. And what I mean by that is this like inherent and ingrained masculinity within, football, and how she's kind of marginalized and isolated. So again, similarities when it comes to isolation, but more so because, there's that excessive pressure on her to prove herself. So she supplied an image, and one of the images was some mountaineers going up a mountain. And we had a conversation. We said, "Oh, so what's going on in this image? How does it capture your well-being?" And there were like a mountaineer in the foreground, some in the midground, and one in the background. And she said, "That's me. They're all me trying to make my way up this mountain. And at the top of the mountain is where all the male coaches are. And that's where I want to make it in men's football." And she says, "It's such a mountain to climb because I have to work even harder to prove myself because I'm a woman." So she found that that was something. So a bit like workaholic kind of tendencies, having to, or feeling like she has to prove herself, whether that's the case or not, but that's, what she felt because that's what the culture she was kind of exposed to in that men's game was kind of forcing or putting that pressure on. There was also similarities and differences in the kind of balances between work and personal life, and bringing in that self-care. One of the things that came out of this were about finding your third space. So there's research out there by a guy called Ray Oldenburg that talks about, as human beings, we have three places or three spaces that we tend to gravitate towards. The first is home. So we have our home. The second is work. And then the third should be our kind of personal space. And 9 times out of 10, that personal space or that me time, that space that we designate for ourselves, tends to get forgotten about or not maybe acknowledged. So again, that might be for the coaches that might be listening is, yes, you might spend a lot of time in your first place at home, your second place at work, or balance that. But what is your time? What is, let's say, me time that maybe could help recharge your well-being, that could maybe be self-care? And for this woman coach, it was going to the gym. So not to get physical well-being gains, but just to switch off, just to have a space where her thoughts can be herself. She's actually putting self-care into her own time, like timed into her own self-care routine. So again, just having that own time to maybe switch off from the coaching and the constant thought processes that come with that. And then maybe just one other thing just to touch upon is, what came from it and resonates with men and women coaches is more so that organizations probably have a duty of care, and there needs to be more systemic changes. So it shouldn't all just be on that coach. It should be organizations maybe, reevaluating their policies, their frameworks, and maybe the kind of targets that they set on coaches and the timeframes that they set to maybe allow more time for that third space, that me time. So again, what does that look like and how could that be beneficial?
Coming from an anecdotal perspective, women, I believe, are probably better at talking about things, difficult things, and probably better at managing their mental health than men are. Did this come up at all in this research with this coach?
It's hard to say because we had conversations like I did with the other coaches, and it's confidential, it's anonymized, so they felt like it was it came across in interviews that it felt like it was a safe space to open up. When it came to this coach in particular, she did mention that she might speak to a mentor, she might confide in some other coaches, which probably wasn't as prominent in some of the others, but that might have been down to certain contextual factors. So it might not just have been down to sex. It might have been down to the level of that coach, the kind of relationships that they had built, how early they might have been in their career compared to more well established. But yeah, with this coach, they did mention about maybe confiding or seeking support from, let's say, more so mentors or well-established coaches, and feeling more secure at being able to maybe confide in them and voice their opinion. But I wouldn't say it was that would go to anybody and open up. Maybe it might have been those select trusted few.
Did you expect most of the outcomes that you got from your findings, or was there some things that really shocked you and stood out or you didn't expect? And this is across the whole research.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really stood out to me is that, and we've been on this podcast now for quite a while, just talking about well-being, is that well-being and the definition, or one of many definitions, talks about being in quite a positive state. Looking at positive quality of life and things that are attributed to that. And 9 times out of 10, when I would ask the question to coaches, how do you view well-being? How do you experience well-being? Or can you bring some images that capture your well-being? 9 times out of 10, it was either them talking about things that impeded their well-being, or more so talking about things that maybe alluded to ill-being. So it was really negative. And I thought that was something that really stood out to me, is that, we're talking about well-being. It should be all about the things that are great, that are going fantastic, that, helping you and giving you happiness and purpose in life, and, maybe giving you energy physically, psychologically. And 9 times out of 10, it wasn't the case. It was more so them identifying and taking the moment to see things that are actually impacting it negatively. So that's something that really stood out. And I think that probably comes down to how, not the stigmatization, but, we talk about mental health, we talk about well-being. Again, mental health is different to mental ill health, but whenever we talk about mental health, we think about all the negatives. So I think there's something linguistically, or maybe the use of language there, that people start to associate the negatives. And I think the reason why that could be the case, and what stands out, and I've spoken to a few people about this, is we tend to notice something when it's missing or when it's absent. So if we go back to that mobile phone analogy, what would be your reaction, James, if you went to touch your pocket and your phone wasn't there if you were out and about?
Yeah, I think, I'm always checking my pockets, even when my phone's in there. I'm like, have I got it? Have I got it? And I'm checking it just to make
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, and it's happened to me before where I might have put my phone somewhere else, but I thought it was in my pocket. I go check it, and I get this horrible feeling. It's like, becomes like, I need it. I really want it. I need that phone back. And it's the same with well-being. If that becomes absent, if that becomes impeded, or it's not working right, or it's gone, it becomes more apparent. And I think that's why the coaches were talking about it in that sense, because we start to notice things when they are affected. It's that kind of taken for grantedness of everyday life where, I'm subject to this as well, where do we take a moment to take a step back and think, things are okay, I'm happy, I'm quite healthy. Actually, we start to pay attention to our health when we've got a runny nose, we've got a cough, and that's when it becomes, oh God, I wish I were feeling well again. When we're not walking around going, yes, I'm feeling great, that doesn't tend to be the case. So that was something that was really interesting that stood out, is that we tend to gravitate towards the negative, when actually we probably should start to focus more so on the actual positive stuff. And that's something that I would like to explore in my own research, is can we try and push past that negative and actually maybe focus upon what are the things that actually positively influence us, what are the things that are beneficial rather than things that detriment it. But I think that just speaks volumes of the coaching profession. There's a lot of things, as we've alluded to, stresses, challenges, demands that could probably impede that. And then one other thing that really stood out is going back to that photo elicitation approach. That was implemented as a data collection method. So to enrich those conversations, get a lot of information. And it actually turned out to be a bit of a well-being management tool. So it had intervention-like properties. And what I mean by that is that it prompted the coaches to take a moment to take a step back and to reflect upon themselves, to reflect upon their well-being. And it kind of forced them to think about it in a genuine fashion, where they had to get images. So it was a task that they couldn't just wing. They had to actually think about it, get pictures. And going through that process made them become more self-aware, to the point where some of the coaches had perceived behavior change. So again, some of the coaches were saying, look, I'm more aware now. I actually pay more attention to family. I get more involved in personal hobbies now because I know that's good for my well-being. It helps me switch off. So one of the things that actually stood out is that photo elicitation approach isn't only a data collection method, but it could be a really good intervention. That's something that I would like to explore further, to see if there is actually any measurable changes that could occur. So they're the two that probably stand out the most there.
That's awesome, mate. I think it's, and I can go back, if I go back to Singapore, I remember you talking about that becoming almost an intervention, and how well you, I guess, enjoyed that aspect of the research, because you actually saw a bit of a change in. And I think if you go back to the coach you mentioned earlier on that brought only photos
Yeah.
of themselves coaching to photos of themselves having dinner with the family and stuff like that, it shows that the research process that you've taken has not just helped you develop research and come up with findings, but it's also had an impact on the coaches that you spoke to, and that's awesome. I think we can all learn a lot from that as well. Andrew, final question, and I'm going to let you go. If there were 3 things you could do to improve coaching and coach well-being, what would they be?
Again, a great question. And is this a magic wand type? If I had a magic wand, or is it actually more so realistic?
Ooh, I think. Well, let's go maybe one magic wand, one or two magic wands, and one or two realistic ones.
Yeah. In an ideal world, I would love it if organizations, governing bodies, or even like, let's say, trade unions were maybe more open to working with researchers or applied practitioners. So, sometimes, let's say, even in professional football, clubs and organizations, even governing bodies, sometimes might have, you know, their defenses and their walls quite high, and they don't really want to let people in. But I'd love it if it would be a little bit more open, and that we could probably enrich findings and kind of practices, and gain those insights and research informed interventions that could lead to maybe more meaningful impact. I think that would be something that I definitely would love to do and be involved in, and working with these, let's say, organizations and governing bodies where you know get researchers involved, get applied practitioners involved. Can we go through, like, let's say, a co-design process where we collaboratively work together so we're on the same page and we can meaningfully implement something? Take, for example, some of the coaches that I spoke to said, if this, what I did with them, so speaking to them using images, this was 4 times out of a season, but they were saying, oh, it could be monthly. They were saying if this was offered as a work intervention, as something I could access at work, I would love to do it. So is it about, can we start to have those more collaborative conversations about how we could maybe purposefully and meaningfully impact and make change and put interventions in place? Another one is because that could lead to potential policy changes. So I think organizations, maybe even governing bodies, might need to start thinking about reworking policies, maybe start actually actioning some that probably look more after the duty of care and self-care regimes of coaches. So, to the point where it's more so widely accepted for a coach to go on a week's holiday, or and not be scrutinized and things like that, where that 24/7 working culture that tends to be celebrated and almost galvanized is probably broken down a little bit. So that's something again. And then I suppose one of the things I kind of thought about, and this is probably a magic wand type moment, is that psychological support probably becomes as perceived as important as physical support, physiological support. So in the sense of where organizations or clubs, I don't want to say compulsory because I don't want to force anything upon anyone, but just to the point where organizations become more psychologically informed. And what I mean by that is you have a sports psychologist on site, or you at least can signpost those individuals to a service that is external from a club. So again, there's that lack of insecurity around, the work at the club, they're going to share this information, which they wouldn't. But for instance, I think a magic wand moment would be that sports psychologists are seen as important as a cog as it is with physiological support, coaching support, skill acquisition, those kind of things, that it all is kind of merged together. So they're the things that I would say I would love to kind of happen in that coaching area.
Yeah, awesome. Andrew, I've loved talking with you this morning, my time, this afternoon, or this evening, your time. It's been really, I've learned a lot, and I'm sure that the people who do listen to this episode will also learn a lot. And I also believe that it's going to help a lot of coaches around the world, especially like the research you're doing, and I guess the continued research that you're going to be doing, focusing on making sure coaches are looking after themselves and recharging their own batteries as well. So thank you so much, mate. Apologies that we've gone a bit over time, and thank you for giving me all that time.
No, thank you ever so much for having me. And again, apologies on my part. It's probably because I've been waffling on way too much.
No, mate. I think it's been great. I've really enjoyed every aspect of it, and I could probably talk for another couple of hours. But I'm also aware that you've got a life to go and look after as
Yeah.
well. So, mate, just before we go, if people want to read your research, you're pretty active on LinkedIn.
Yep.
Is that the best space to find you? Are you on any other social media or any other?
Yeah. Yeah, so LinkedIn's great. So if you search Andrew Higham on there, also I've got a ResearchGate profile. So again, Dr. Andrew Higham, it will tend to come up. And if you're struggling to find certain aspects, then feel free to reach out. So my email is in the public domain on Shefield Hallam's website, for example. But yeah, LinkedIn and also a little bit active on X as well, even though that's debatable at the moment with everything going on with X.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. And I really appreciate your time.
No, thank you ever so much for having us.
I have to say, I really enjoyed this conversation with Andrew. It did make me think a lot about my own well-being as a coach and made me consider how often I recharge my own batteries. After that conversation, I think well-being is essential for both the coach's personal well-being and the success of their teams. Coaching is a demanding job that requires immense dedication, time, and energy at all levels, from amateur to professional. It's easy for coaches to prioritise their athletes' needs over their own, but neglecting self-care can lead to burnout, stress, and decreased effectiveness. Maintaining well-being allows coaches to be at their best, both mentally and physically. When coaches take care of themselves, they can bring more energy, positivity, and focus to their teams. This not only enhances their coaching performance, but also sets a positive example for their athletes. It's important for coaches to find a balance between their professional responsibilities and their personal lives. This might involve setting boundaries, seeking support from colleagues, and making time for activities that bring joy and relaxation. Coaches should feel empowered to seek help if they're struggling and to create an environment where mental health is openly discussed and supported. And organisations should also support their coaches in providing this support. As we wrap up, I encourage all coaches to take a moment to reflect on their own well-being. Are you taking the necessary steps to care for yourself? Remember, a healthy coach is a more effective coach. Thank you for joining us today. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with other coaches who might benefit from these insights. Until next time, prioritise your well-being and continue to inspire athletes.